Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
It's time to turn off the lights and turn on the dark.
Chilling tales for dark nights.
Good evening, listener. You're listening to Chilling Tales for Dark Nights. On tonight's edition, we invite you to leave behind your safe reality and descend with us into the frightening depths of the most terrifying imaginations with two audio adaptations of frightening fiction about struggling storytellers and barricaded bathrooms. I'm your host, Steve Taylor, and tonight I'll be your guide as we traverse the dimly lit corridors of your darkest dreams. Joining us tonight to help bring to life the frightening fiction of Carole Wood and Mr-Outlaw are voice talents Paul J. McSorley, Nick Goroff, Olivia Steele, and Kevin Barbare. Now, get your ticket ready. Take your seat in our theater of the minds and brace yourself. It's time to turn off the lights and turn on the dark. Our first tale this evening is written by Carole Wood and performed by Paul J. McSorley, Nick Goroff, and Olivia Steele. When their car breaks down along a lonely country road, the couple is offered help by a pair of strangers driving by. The two parties soon realize that not everything is what it seems, and soon things take a much more sinister turn. Now, without further ado, I present to you Unraveling Pages.
The blank page. Pete fears it above all else. Two outcomes are possible: the potential to tell an engaging story that will entertain millions, or the utter failure to write a single good word. Sometimes it hypnotizes him for hours. He thinks about the relief he would feel if he could just begin, but he can't seem to manifest the words. So he sits in his comfortable leather chair and stares at the white page on his computer screen. But it's not actually white when he really looks at it. The screen turns it a kind of gray. He fancies it's the same color as the inside of his brain, hazy and lifeless. If only he could write something, the page would come to life. It's been a long time since he's felt that tantalizing invitation, the pull of a story. Pete's wife, Helen, takes a cup of coffee to him at 12 o'clock every day. Every day she asks him the same question, and every day his reply is the same. "Nothing yet, honey." This is when he most feels like breaking the screen of his laptop and using the tiny shards to slit his wrists open. He can picture it vividly. Dark red blood pooling between the buttons of the keyboard, the spatter on his white coffee cup. But it's just a fantasy. He hasn't completed so much as a short story in over 2 months. Never endured writer's block for this long before. It's usually just a couple of days here and there, brought on by stress or worrying too much about where a story is heading. That's a surefire way to summon it. Pete finds he works better when he writes by instinct. He's never been much of a plotter, preferring the pantser approach instead. In the past, it infuriated his college professors that he refused to conform, but it worked out just fine until now. Fine and dandy. Pansing helped him become a best-selling crime fiction author, one that makes so much money writing stories that sometimes he thinks he's the one who committed a crime. Pete never flashes his wealth about, but has made a comfortable home for he and his wife. Helen gently opens the door and sets his coffee on the coaster by his laptop. It features swaying palms backlit by a perfect sunset, one of a set they bought on their honeymoon in Bali. He thanks her and she leaves as quietly as she came in. Pete knows he's a lucky man. They've been married for 11 years now, and most of them were good. He published his first book 2 years into their marriage, and no one was more supportive throughout the whole process than she. They found out they couldn't have kids shortly before that. At the time, it was a hard blow, but they've gotten used to it over the years. After they adopted a dog they named Bach, then a tabby cat called Tutu, he understood there was much love to be had in caring for those two furry creatures. On Friday morning, Pete is sitting in front of the computer again. He wonders why he even bothers anymore. Couldn't he be doing something more productive? The shed needs a coat of weatherproofing and the garage is in desperate need of a clean. He could add 10 more things to that list, but instead he brings his attention back to the screen. The blinking cursor winks at him, willing him to type something. A combination of anxiety and coffee has turned his stomach into an acrid knot. Ideas run through his head, but he can't seem to get them out. He's afraid to actually type them onto the page. If he does, then he'll have started something that he has to finish. And what if he can't? So he sits a while instead.
Pete?
Pete lifts his head from the desk. It's dark outside the window and the room is cold. He realizes he's been asleep. Helen is standing in the doorway. A look of concern knits her pretty features into a frown.
It's dinner time, honey. Are you okay?
He runs a hand through his hair, in need of a cut, and tries to shake himself awake. I'm fine. I guess I fell asleep.
Well, I made lasagna, your favorite, so don't be long.
Her tone is light, but the frown hasn't entirely abated. I'll be right behind you. Pete gives her a reassuring smile. He takes the screensaver off, which is set to come on after 60 minutes of inactivity, and is about to shut down the computer when he sees that the blank page is no longer blank. He sits up straight and rolls his chair back so violently it looks as if the screen has bitten him. There is writing on the page. A whole lot of it. He slowly comes closer again and peers at the screen, reading some of the words. It's a story, all right, but not one of his. It's not even crime fiction. In fact, it seems to be more like horror, something he wouldn't have the first clue about writing. For a second, he thinks maybe he's opened an email attachment by accident. Fans/aspiring writers often send him stuff to look at, but never through his personal email address. Only a handful of people know it. Also, in the top right corner of the page, his surname, Kessler, has been typed. He knows he hasn't bothered to do that himself. Scrolling through the document, he sees there are 50 pages of writing. Even on his best day, Pete could never write that much. There's a good chunk of a novel here. He hears Helen call his name and remembers she has dinner waiting for him in the kitchen. Maybe he just needs a break from the screen, or the cold room. He puts a hand on the radiator and it's freezing. He wonders why the heating isn't working in here. Another thing to add to the list. Maybe after dinner an explanation as to the source of the document will have presented itself. He saves it in a hurry and shuts down the computer fully, thinking this will help somehow. His hands are shaking only slightly, but he's pretty sure a glass of wine is in order. Maybe a bottle. The following day, Pete turns on the computer again. Last night, most of the way through a bottle of red, he decided to put off the mystery until morning. The cold dawn light filters through the window of the modest study, giving the room a shadowy aspect. The text is still there, in the file he saved as unknown. He begins to read the story. It starts off with a writer struggling to complete his 5th book. Upon moving into an old farmhouse by the sea, hoping for inspiration, he soon finds out he's not alone in the house. A terrifying attack on his sanity ensues. By the time Pete finishes reading, he feels exhausted, as if the text contains some form of visual soporific. For some reason, he doesn't want to print out the pages. Having the story in physical form would be too much like sorcery. He can just about accept that it exists in cyberspace, but to hold it in his hands would make him feel like screaming. Also, he has a suspicion that the printed pages might be blank, or worse, the words might evaporate before his eyes. He is no way prepared for that, so instead he sits back and stares at the screen. Not blank anymore, but full of words he didn't write. Words that he is just now considering claiming as his own. It would get him out of a jam, this writer's block nightmare he's been living. The next thing Pete's aware of is the feeling of something wet and hard under his cheek. He jolts upright in his swivel chair and sees the small puddle of drool on his polished wooden desk. It's dark outside again and he is starving. Wasn't it only morning not so long ago? He starts to shut down the laptop and sees there is more writing. Another 100 or so pages. Scrolling back to the top of the document, he sees there is still no title to the piece. He presses save and goes to the kitchen to find out what Helen has cooked for dinner. His eyes are burning and his stomach is on the verge of consuming itself, just as if he had been working hard all day. Helen sees the shadows under his eyes and questions him on his progress.
Why don't you leave it alone for a little while? Take some time to clear your head.
Not yet, honey. I think I might be onto something, but it's too early to tell. She knows better than to push him further, so they sit down to eat. Pete has 3 helpings of casserole and then dessert. After dinner, he goes back to his study. Bach has made a bed in the footwell of his desk. The Labrador snores lightly. Pete reads the new text that has appeared in the document he has begun to think of as the Gremlin file. The writing is good, great even, and there are no typos. He finds this disturbing. The protagonist, Patrick, has finally lost all his marbles and is plotting to murder the person he believes is responsible. A woman who creeps around the house, doing little things to make him think he's gone crazy, like repeatedly hiding his glasses in strange places and spilling milk all over the kitchen floor. Sometimes she even deletes his writing. Pete reads to the end and shuts down the computer for the night. Later, asleep in bed, he dreams that he is walking through a house, but it's not his own. It is the farmhouse of the novel. Dark and silent but sentient, watching and waiting. In the dream, he feels confused and disoriented. Ghostly shadows dance on the walls and he follows them like a trail of breadcrumbs. He rounds a corner leading to the kitchen and comes face to face with Patrick, the unhinged creation of the Gremlin file. Patrick's wire-framed glasses glint in the cold light of the moon, and behind him 2 shadows flicker on the wall. He is smiling. A puddle of milk on the floor mimics the roiling whites of his eyes, seeming to shimmer in the dark. He grabs Pete by the collar and shoves a sheaf of papers into his face.
See?
He screams.
It will be read and it will spread.
On the topmost page, Pete can make out some of the lines. There once was a boy named Pat. He had a great big trap. He threw her in, then cursed her sins, and she hit with a great big splat. The nightmare ends before he can read more, and he wakes drenched in a cold sweat. It takes him a long time to go back to sleep. The Gremlin file is complete by the end of the week. 284 pages of text that Pete has no explanation for. In the end, Patrick succeeds in murdering the woman who terrorizes him, but there's a twist, one he had never have thought of. All in all, it's a terrific story. The whole manuscript is there, but still no title. It makes him feel that the story isn't finished somehow. It seems naked without a name. He doesn't really want to, but he leaves it blank. After all, who is he to name a story he never raised a finger to write? Another week passes and he still hasn't written a word, but the Gremlin file lingers in his mind. He can't let go of it, and his nightmares have gotten worse. Now, instead of waking up after Patrick shows him the manuscript, the dream continues. Pete takes it from him and proceeds to flip through it straight to the end. Thus preoccupied, Patrick uses the opportunity to do the unthinkable. One moment Pete is reading and the next he feels a hard shove, then a push inside his brain like the beginnings of a migraine. He feels himself shrink until the awareness of the thing that has invaded him takes over. He sees his reflection in the glass of the oven door and begins to scream. Then he wakes up. One day, while he sits staring out the window of his study, Pete decides to try a little experiment. He goes to page 1 of the manuscript and clicks Print 1 page only. His hands begin to sweat as the printer grabs the paper, sucks it in, spills its ink, and then spits the page back out again. The text is all there, the same as on his screen. Next, he tries printing a whole chapter. Same result. 3/4 of an hour later, he has printed all the pages and the entire manuscript lies in a neat pile on his desk. Tutu comes into the room, meowing for attention. She jumps up on the desk, but when she comes into contact with the paper, her hackles rise and she growls way down low in her throat before running for the door. Pete feels the hair prickle on the back of his own neck. Tutu is afraid of nothing and no one. Helen even jokes that it's like she decided to oppose her name by being the fiercest tabby in the neighborhood. He quickly shoves the stack of paper into the bottom desk drawer and, for reasons he can't articulate, locks it afterwards. The next day, he checks the bottom drawer to make sure the manuscript's still there, and it is, nestled as comfortably as a snake in a basket. Pete slams the drawer shut and relocks it before turning on the laptop to pull up the digital file. No harm in checking that too, he reasons. But the file isn't there. He looks again, then searches through his recent folders, but it's not there either. His palms begin to sweat. Had he backed it up? Surely, but when? No recollection comes to mind, so he drags his usual flash drives from their top drawer and begins to plug them in one by one, searching in vain. He feels like kicking himself because what kind of writer doesn't back up their work? A plagiaristic one, perhaps. Pete slams the heel of his hand down on the desk, making the half-empty cup of coffee jump and slosh over the rim. He restarts the computer and searches again. Same deal. No manuscript. A thought comes to him, unlikely but not impossible. Helen. Pete races out of the office into the kitchen, but she isn't there. He finds her in the basement folding laundry. She's humming to herself, a kind of lullaby. The sound does nothing to calm Pete's fury. "What have you done with it?" Helen stops humming and looks up. Her eyes are wide.
What, honey?
"The manuscript! The file!"
You mean your book?
"Yes, goddammit, the book! It's gone off my computer!" She makes an "oh" sound and reaches out to pat his arm.
Oh, honey, what happened? Did you not back it up?
"Apparently not. Were you in my office on my computer?"
I never go in there except to clean, you know that. And I certainly wouldn't interfere with your laptop or your work for that matter.
She sighed.
What's gotten into you?
"It's gone. I mean, I have a hard copy, but the file is gone. Are you sure you didn't use my laptop for something? Online shopping, maybe?" She sighs again, and the sound makes him wonder what it would be like to put his hands around her throat.
Yes, Pete, I'm sure. Maybe leave it for a bit and have a look again later. You know how funny technology can be.
That's not how computers work, Helen.
Well, at least you still have the print copy. That's something.
Pete's anger gauge hovers at rage for a moment longer. Then he recognizes he's being unreasonable. Worse, a downright asshole. Had he really been contemplating hurting her? "Maybe you're right. I think I'll go for a walk, and who knows, maybe it'll magically appear when I get back, like you said." Helen smiles, visibly relieved at the change in Pete's demeanor, and goes back to folding laundry. She begins to hum the lullaby again, which unnerves him in a way he cannot say. Rather than ask her what it is, he retreats upstairs. The digital file never shows up, and Pete waits another 3 weeks before contacting his agent, John Reed. "I have a new manuscript for you." There's a satisfied chuckle on the other end of the line.
"I knew you'd get over that writer's block. Always do." So, can I expect the usual then?
Pete pauses. He can't quite believe what he's about to do. It's something of a departure, actually.
Oh.
It's, sort of horror. John lets out a small gasp.
Departure may be an understatement. I don't know how Greg will take it. You're a best-selling crime writer, Pete. You know how publishers are about change. Especially nowadays.
I know, John, but it's what I've got. I didn't exactly set out to write a horror novel.
Yes, but you must have known.
Pete interrupts him before he can inquire further. I'll send it over this afternoon, okay? John surrenders.
Fine. I'll do my best.
That's all I ask. He notices his hands are shaking as he hangs up the phone. It's become a common occurrence. The manuscript is all packaged up and ready to go. It's less threatening somehow inside the white cardboard box. Pete decides to bring it to the post office himself, afraid to let it out of his sight until he hands it over to the postal worker. Will John know that he didn't write it? Does it matter? After all, he has no way of disproving it. And on that train of thought, is Pete himself sure he didn't write it? Helen is delighted at first when he shows her the package.
I knew you could do it, honey.
She pats him on the shoulder. But when she sees the box is sealed, she does that little frown of hers.
How come you didn't let me read it first?
Her tone isn't harsh, only wounded.
It's our tradition.
He hadn't even considered it, but now he sees how strange it must look. Well, I clean forgot, and John wants it ASAP. She nods.
You've been so tired lately, it must have slipped your mind. Let's go out to dinner Friday night to celebrate, and I can read it another time. We haven't done anything fun in ages.
You're right. We're due some fun. But inside he feels that celebrating will only magnify his sense of cheating. How on earth will he make it through a book tour at this rate? John gets back to him 2 days later.
I've finished it, and Pete, I gotta say, at first I was wary. Downright apprehensive. But once it got going, I saw that despite the fact it's a different genre for you, your voice really shines through.
Pete lets out a huge sigh of relief, but then quickly begins to panic again when he grasps the meaning of what John has said. His voice. How can that be? He quickly pushes the problem aside. So, do you think there'll be much of a problem selling the idea to Greg?
Maybe initially, but I'm feeling a lot more confident now that I've read it myself. I think once he reads it, he'll come around too.
Okay, good. Let me know how things go.
Oh, one other thing.
John pauses for a moment, and the coffee in Pete's stomach races up his esophagus. He swallows it back down, waits for the inevitable question, the inevitable accusation.
There's no title.
What?
There isn't a title, Pete. An oversight, I presume? Must have been in one hell of a hurry to get it to me.
He chuckles at his own wit. Pete struggles to think of a simple explanation. I haven't found one that fits right yet, he says truthfully. But you'll be the first to know when I do.
All right. And Pete.
Oh no, he thinks. Here it comes.
Take a break, why don't you? Take that lovely wife of yours out on the town. You've earned it. And you need it by the sounds of things.
So he hasn't been concealing his discomfort as well as he thought. Pete assures him that he will and hangs up the phone. He watches Helen put on the string of pearls that he gave her for their 10th anniversary. She still looks as beautiful as the day he married her, if a little careworn around the eyes. He knows the etchings of time are written on his own face too, more so lately. She's wearing her most expensive perfume. It fills his head with the scents of jasmine and lily, but the smell is somehow sickly, like a funeral home. The restaurant is busy, but the staff know Pete well and they are seated and served within minutes. Their waiter, Darius, brings over the champagne. You've finished another book then, Mr. Kessler? Pete nods. They've been carrying out this ritual since he sold his first novel. Congratulations. I can't wait to read it.
He hasn't even let me sneak a peek yet, Darius.
Oh, really? Mystery looks good on you, Mr. Kessler. Darius replies, eyeing Pete's flat stomach. He's lost quite a bit of weight, something he only noticed when he put on his dress pants. He smiles in a distracted way, and the waiter whirls away to the kitchen. The food is delicious as always, but Pete finds that he has little appetite. He picks at his swordfish and plays with his salad. The bottle of champagne, however, is gone in a few gulps. He knows Helen has noticed his odd behavior, but it seems she's decided to let it pass. When they arrive home, she announces she is tired. This is not how the night would usually go, but Pete is so preoccupied that he just kisses her goodnight, and she goes up to bed. He goes to his study and opens his laptop. The room is freezing again, and he remembers he had neglected to call the plumber. When the computer has logged on, he opens the blank document he created the day before in the hopes of beginning his next book. There's nothing there. He's relieved and faintly disappointed. The weight of his secret is already taking its toll, but he reasons it's all out of his hands now. His publisher is probably reading the Gremlin file right this second. Before long, it will be in every bookstore in the country and beyond. And most troubling of all, on the internet. The Gremlin file gone global, gone viral. To Pete, it does feel like a virus, and he's the one coming down with the symptoms. His eyes slowly close and his head feels so heavy. Soon, he's asleep, face down on the desk.
Pete? I can't see anything. Where are you? What happened to the lights?
She awoke because of a noise downstairs, and now the lamp beside her bed isn't working. The other side of the bed is empty. She pulls back the covers and feels around for her slippers. Once she has located them, she slides her feet inside and fumbles for the knob on the bedroom door. The landing is darker than the bedroom, so she keeps to the wall as she makes her way slowly down the stairs.
Pete?
She feels something brush against her leg and lets out a yelp before realizing it's only the cat. Tutu meows and slides past Helen up the stairs. She presumes that Bach is sleeping in the conservatory like any other night, but he isn't barking at whatever is making the noise. When there's still no response from Pete, her mind begins to race. What if he's hurt or unconscious? Or worse, what if someone has broken in? She has nothing to defend herself with, and the house is so dark. Suddenly, she feels immensely vulnerable. Also stupid. Maybe, she thinks, it would be best to go back upstairs to find a suitable weapon before blindly charging down into God knows what situation. Another noise comes from the kitchen, the sound of a pot being knocked over. Helen inhales sharply and holds her breath, afraid to alert an intruder to her presence. She has reached the bottom of the stairs in one piece and is now standing between Pete's study and the kitchen door. She hears a drawer open and bang shut, and her heart speeds up. She's too afraid now to even call her husband's name, positive he's been knocked unconscious by a burglar. After a moment's indecision, she opts to creep back upstairs to retrieve her phone and call for help. But before she has a chance to carry out her plan, the kitchen door swings open and crashes against the wall. She sees the glint of moonlight on metal and screams. Making a run for it, Helen dashes to the stairs and takes them 2 and 3 at a time. She is halfway to the top when a hand grabs her calf. The hand feels cold and hard. The fingernails dig into her flesh, blunt but gouging all the same. She screams again, but the hand begins to drag her back down the stairs. She tries to kick out with her free leg, but it's no use. She can't find anything to kick. She feels herself being twisted around as she's dragged to the bottom of the stairs. Suddenly, she's on her back and someone is on top of her, pinning her to the ground. She thrashes about, but they are so strong and she can see the glint of the kitchen knife, the one she uses to chop vegetables, gleaming in the hand that isn't around her neck. "Stop fighting it," a man's voice commands. She finds his voice vaguely familiar, and it disturbs her enough that she stops struggling for a moment. Maybe Pete is waiting somewhere to come up behind this man and knock him unconscious. If he's not already dead, that is. "That's better. I don't want to hurt you any more than I have to." That voice again, familiar but not. Something about it. The darkness is so disorienting. She's about to ask him what he wants when it dawns on her that the voice belongs to Pete. He sounds different, detached, but it's definitely him all right. The realization hits her like a cold slap. She tries to scream again, this time not for her husband to save her, but to spare her. He takes the hand from around her neck and clamps it over her mouth. Tears begin to slide down her face. She tries to say his name, but his hand silences her. When he moves his head, a sliver of moonlight illuminates his eyes as she sees that they are huge and glittering, the rest of his face shrouded in chiaroscuro.
I know what you were planning. I can't believe you would sell me out like that. My own wife. Imagine how betrayed I felt when I discovered what you were up to.
Helen has no idea what Pete is talking about. Selling him out. Crazy talk.
Nobody makes a fool out of Pete Kessler. I might not have written that book, but I'm the one paying the price for its existence.
He takes his hand from her mouth and grabs her by the chin.
Look at me, Helen. Haven't you noticed how unwell I've been these past few weeks? I'm sick, honey. That book is making me sick. I know it. But if I let you carry out your little scheme, I'll be a whole lot sicker.
She motions for him to let her speak, but he silences her once more, and besides, he's looking at her like a bug under a light. Quite suddenly, she understands the extent of his psychosis. Something inside her breaks and then reforms.
It wants something from me, Helen,
he whispers, leaning in close so that she can smell the soured champagne from the restaurant on his breath.
It wants to spread far and wide, and if you open your big mouth, then everything will be ruined. It will kill me. I know it. At first, I tried to pretend it wasn't there. I left it alone for weeks, but I felt so ill that eventually I gave in. I succumbed.
Helen starts to look around for a means of escape, but he is so very heavy and she can't move. And then there's the knife. The knife! Maybe she can grab it somehow. Oh, if he had just listened to her for a moment, she could reassure him that this was all just a delusion brought on by stress and they could fix it together. Before she can work out her next move, Pete's voice rises until he is screaming in her face.
The Gremlin file will be read. It will be read and it will spread. It will be read and it will spread. It will be read and it will spread.
He repeats it over and over, seeming to go into a trance. Helen, seeing her opportunity, tries to get one arm free so that she might grab the knife. The time for talking is over. Pete notices her struggling and his eyes clear. For a moment, they are kind and gentle, the eyes of her husband, and she tries to reason with him.
Pete, what are you doing? It's me, Pete. It's Helen, your wife.
I'm sorry, honey. I don't like this any more than you do.
His voice is full of regret, but he hasn't let go of the knife.
Please, Pete, we can figure this out, whatever it is. I'll ring the doctor tomorrow. You've obviously been under a lot of stress. I'm sorry I didn't take more notice, but we can fix this.
It's too late for that, honey. I'm so sorry, but it's the only way.
Then he is plunging the knife deep into the middle of her chest. The pain is immense. She tries to scream, but there is no breath. Blood immediately begins to soak through her silk nightdress. It's like slipping into a warm bath, and for a moment, the look of shock and horror that passes over her face is replaced by something like peace. And then nothing. A blank expression. A blank page. What started this nightmare? He gently lowers her eyelids and kisses each one in reverence. Bach begins to bark outside in the garage. The next day, Pete calls John. "I've got a title for you." There's a pause and John exclaims,
Well, don't keep me in suspense.
"The Unraveling." The agent chuckles.
Creepy. It's perfect. You know, I think I like this new direction you've taken. Well done, Pete. I'll pass it on to Greg straight away. He's gonna go nuts for it.
Pete laughs generously.
With any luck. Tell me, how have you been feeling lately?
Funny you ask, because I'm bushed every night. Can't seem to get enough sleep these days. Totally unlike me. Why?
Oh, no reason, Pete replies. That book can be a bit of a killer.
I hope you enjoyed Unraveling Pages, as written by Carole Wood and performed by Paul J. McSorley, Nick Goroff, and Olivia Steele. Carole Wood is a singer-songwriter from Wexford, Ireland, where she lives with her husband and 4 cats. She writes horror, speculative fiction, and occasionally some eco-poetry. Wood is studying a BA with honors in English in creative writing at University College Dublin. She was awarded the 1916 Bursary in 2020, and her work has been published in Caveat Lector and Envelope. Our second tale of the evening is written by Mr-Outlaw and performed by Kevin Barbare. Cohabitating with someone can be one hell of an experience, in ways both good and bad, of course. And one of the biggest bones of contention can be none other than the most private place, the bathroom. Without further ado, I present to you, my roommate has been in the shower for more than 4 hours.
So I got home at around 11 p.m. Late night at the office turned into an even later night at the bar. About 4 drinks deep at this point, and I'm tired, just about ready to fall asleep as I stumble through the doorway. I lay down on the couch and reach for my bag of joints and spark one up as I pull YouTube on my laptop. I'm in the middle of watching some luxury cruise tour, close to passing out, when I hear the front door open. I sit up and turn my head slightly, just enough to see my roommate coming in. He hangs his jacket in the closet and doesn't say anything and walks slowly to his room, which is normal enough. I've been living with him for about 3 months, long enough for me to pick up on most of his tendencies. The guy really doesn't talk unless spoken to, which was far from a problem for me. He also generally kept things clean on his end, never causing much in the way of problems. I really couldn't complain. So I go back to watching YouTube, and about 5 minutes later I hear the shower in his room turning on. Once again, nothing strange. At this point, I'm watching bare-knuckle boxing highlights with my eyes half open, maybe 1 or 2 minutes away from passing out. I remember waking up in darkness, my head hurting, my throat dry as hell. I sat up slowly, waiting for the grogginess to settle into something manageable. Once it did, I grabbed my phone and checked the time. Around 3:30 a.m. from what I remember. I was starving, and so I got up and began walking towards the fridge. And then I noticed it, a soft but ever-present noise in the background. It took me a few seconds to really recognize what it was. The shower. Suddenly, the events of last night began replaying in my head. Drinking at the bar, Ubering home, laptop, couch, my roommate coming home, the shower turning on. I stood there for a while, trying to make sense of it. Maybe he went to bed and forgot to turn it off. I shook my head. There's no way that happened, I thought. Maybe he slipped and fell. Realizing the implications of this, I rushed towards his room but found his bathroom door locked. I began pounding on it. "Hey man, you all right?" No response. I considered kicking the door down but decided to call 911 before I did that. I took my phone out, preparing to dial when I noticed that I had an unread text, one from my roommate. "Hey man, I couldn't sleep, so I went over to my girlfriend's place. Not sure when I'll be back." Sent 2 hours ago. I look at the bathroom door, then back down at my phone. Everything about this was wrong. First of all, my roommate barely texts me, and certainly never to tell me that he's going out. Second of all, I know for a fact that he's single and has been for a while. And third of all, Who the fuck was in the shower then? I tried calling him. No answer. Sent him some texts, but no response. I walked over to his desk and saw that his keys and wallet were still beside his laptop. My head's starting to spin at this point, and I get out of there, go back into the living room and turn on the lights. I'm pacing around in a circle, trying to follow the plot while also trying to ignore the shower, a noise that I never could have imagined being so dreadful in any context. Sometime later, I hear something vibrating on the kitchen counter. I move towards it and see that it's a phone, my roommate's phone. The panic begins setting in, and immediately I grab my keys and run out of the apartment. I make my way down the hall and take the stairs down to the lobby, but even that doesn't seem far enough away, and so I make my way over to the McDonald's across the street. I sit there for a while, considering calling the cops, but for some reason feeling too nervous to do so. But even though there's hardly anybody in there, the place begins to feel suffocating, and I decided to leave, walking back out onto the empty streets. Almost immediately, I get this feeling that I'm being watched, and I feel my gaze drifting up and towards the apartment. Soon, I'm looking at my balcony and I see somebody standing there. A dark figure stood completely straight, stiff to the point where it nearly resembles a mannequin. But it isn't one. If I look closely, I can see it just slightly swaying. I froze in place, my mind hardly able to understand or accept what it was seeing. It's not my roommate. It's too tall. In fact, it's too tall to be anybody I know, its head nearly scraping the bottom of the balcony above. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't make out any of its details. The darkness and distance may have been enough to explain that away, but there was something about it that drove me towards a different conclusion, that this thing simply possessed no details that could have been observed, that the only element of its composition was that of unadulterated darkness. Of course, my gut instinct was to get the hell away from it, but the voice in my head was telling me that if I were to try and run, this thing would end up following me. I went back into the McDonald's instead, locking myself in the bathroom as I finally dialed 911. I told the operator that somebody had broken into my place, but that I had gotten out of there without them noticing, but they were still in there. It was the story that most accurately represented the situation without making me come across as batshit. The operator told me that they'd be sending somebody over for me to hang tight. I left the bathroom, waiting at the table closest to the exit until I could see the red and blue lights cutting through the darkness. I went outside to meet the cops, looking up at the balcony to find it empty, though the door to the living room had been left open. They pelted me with a bunch of questions that I found difficult to answer. Is the intruder armed? Do I have an idea who it might be? What are their intentions? I told them I didn't know, that I couldn't figure it out, but they just kept on asking. Soon, I was practically yelling at them to go up there and check it out for themselves, and I suppose the terror in my voice was enough for them to begin taking this seriously. They told me to wait by the entrance, and I watched on as they entered the building. I was out there for a long time, growing increasingly anxious at the thought of what they were going to tell me when they came down. A few minutes later, the silence was broken by a single, muffled gunshot. My heart dropped into my stomach, and I continued to wait there, unsure of what to do otherwise. 20 more minutes of silence, and the officers still hadn't come down. Soon, I could hear more of them approaching in the distance. Before I knew it, 4 more cop cars had pulled up around me, and the scene had fallen into chaos. Officers shouting over each other and into their radios. More questions being hurled my way, none of which I was able to answer. The next few sequences were mostly a blur, but I remember the building being evacuated, the tenants frightened and confused as they were ushered outside, while the officers became more and more frantic. I remembered hearing more scattered gunshots, some screaming, other noises that were difficult to make sense of. There were a few lapses in my memory after that, but I recall being pushed into the back of a police car. After being driven to the station, I was led into one of the interrogation rooms where I found 2 nondescript men in suits waiting for me. They didn't introduce themselves and immediately went into a series of questions, each one more bizarre than the last. What company was your roommate employed by? What was the nature of his job? How many different people have been inside your apartment since your roommate moved in? Have you ever heard voices inside the apartment from the hours of midnight to 3 a.m., voices that did not belong to your roommate? Have you ever seen a circle of people standing outside of the apartment from the hours of midnight to 3 a.m., people that were exceptionally tall? And one of the most unsettling ones, have you ever seen somebody standing at the foot of your bed upon waking up between the hours of midnight to 3 a.m., only for them to disappear moments later? If so, do you remember what they looked like? Any distinct features? As they continued probing me, my mind began conjuring up some of the strange shit that had happened after my roommate had moved in. Shit that I had written off as figments of my imagination simply because I had no other explanation for them. I did hear the voices, always coming from the room next to mine where my roommate slept. I was always so tired when I heard them, but I do remember it either sounding like a young woman or a man. It always sounded like gibberish. And then there was that one time where I went to the bathroom in the middle of the night, still half asleep. I didn't bother turning the lights on as I entered, but as my eyes began adjusting to the dark, I could have sworn that somebody was already sitting on the toilet. Somebody extremely tall. Of course, when I turned on the lights, nothing was there. It was easy to chalk it up as a product of late-night drowsiness at the time, and I had never really thought about it since. After doing my best to give them useful information, the suits spent a good few minutes taking notes on their phones. Once they were done, they sat up quickly, told me that they'd be in touch before leaving the room. A cop came in a few minutes later and told me that since I couldn't return to the apartment, they would set me up in a nearby hotel until they were able to get the situation under control, and that I should stay put until they gave me a call. "What happened?" I asked him. "What did you guys find up there?" He stared at me for a long time, not as if he were deep in thought, but as if he held deep aversion for what he was considering telling me. Eventually, he just shook his head. "I don't know," he said. "I mean, I really don't know." I nodded, tried to smile, though I'm sure it didn't come across very well. It's the next day now, and I'm in the hotel. Of course I couldn't sleep. Couldn't really eat. The officer hasn't called me yet. When I try searching up information about the evacuation on the internet, all I can find are articles claiming that it was due to a fire. A fucking fire! Update. I fell asleep and I just woke up. It's 1 a.m. now, and I can hear the shower.
I hope you enjoyed My Roommate Has Been in the Shower for More Than 4 Hours, as written by Mr-Outlaw and performed by Kevin Barbare. This tale comes to us by a trusted old friend, the No Sleep subreddit. Mr. Outlaw's work, along with many others, can be found right here on this forum. Kevin Barbare follows a career in broadcasting, most notably as former co-host of a morning radio show in Boston for 20 years. His impressions of famous people from politics, film, and television have kept him in demand for projects across the globe. He currently resides in Massachusetts. Well, on to the shows. Longtime resident Otis Gyrie has his very own show here on our network, Scary Stories Told in the Dark, which you can hear every Sunday night. We also have Eric Peabody's Horror Hill, a podcast dedicated to some of our deeper and darker tales. We hope you check him out. And Drew Blood's Dark Tales airs Fridays, featuring some Southern down-home horror. And don't forget to check out The Fear from the Heartland Archives, featuring more than 120 episodes. Well, friends, our weekly descent into the depths has just about come to a close. But before we go, I'd like to take a moment to thank you for joining us for tonight, and remind you to take a moment to stop by our iTunes page and leave Chilling Tales for Dark Nights a 5-star review and a kind word. And follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram if you haven't already. And of course, subscribe to us on YouTube, where you can find an archive of our work going back to 2012. And consider signing up as a patron at our website, chillingtalesfordarknights.com, to show your support and get all of our content ad-free. I'm your host of the evening, Steve Taylor, and it's been a pleasure. Tune in again next week when we once again turn off the lights and turn on the dark. Sweet dreams, listener. Sweet dreams.